Thank you very much, Liviana. I've worked with Ted and Liviana and Dan for close on a decade now, so it's actually lovely to be here. They've been to visit us, and so it's very nice to come here. Thank you. I want to talk about what I call speaking truth to power, which you may know is a famous quote from Edward Said. And in doing so, I'm going to use his work quite extensively because I think he's one of the theorists who certainly has influenced me most widely in dealing with HIV and AIDS in South Africa. There is, of course, not a little irony in my being asked to do this address, because I represent, I suppose, at one and the same time, the country with the very worst epidemic in the world, and perhaps until very recently, but I fear maybe even now, one of the most complicated and confusing responses to the epidemic we have ever seen. I've worked now on HIV since 1989, and in that time I've seen the epidemic in my country go from less than 1% of the population to over 10% and now edging closer to 15%, with dramatic rises in antenatal figures. Living as I do then in the epicenter of this epidemic positions me, I think, very differently from people who do research and conduct interventions in other countries who are facing very different epidemics. And in our response, I think we have learned a great deal, not only about the epidemic itself, but also about the societies in which this epidemic is playing itself out. And I hope that some of these lessons may also apply to some of your work here in Canada. So what is our first lesson, perhaps? I think our first lesson that we've really come to understand is that we knew, and indeed still know, very little about the societies in which this epidemic is expanding. Initially and erroneously in South Africa, believed to be a gay epidemic, as in the West, it was assumed that this population would respond to the epidemic as had other gay communities before them. Soon, though, we realized a double stigma. The usual issues of blame and condemnation, along with the refusal to accept the reality of gay life, but in addition, the racism that was very quickly attached to gayness, with the rising tide of denial that there are or were black African gay men. Nearly 3 days into this epidemic, we still have African leaders, most notably the one to the north of us, declaring gayness as a Western construct, as alien to the African soil. No matter, the damage was done, and the shame and blame that was so easily attached to gayness spilled over into the shame and blame that has now become attached to the general heterosexual epidemic. And once this happened, we found endlessly that it's the stigma we have to address rather than the epidemic itself, leading to all kinds of failures and missing all kinds of crucial opportunities. But the question I want to ask in this lesson is, who were we in the late 1980s when this epidemic took off? And perhaps more crucially, who are we now in South Africa 2 decades later? Then we were a country in turmoil, hovering perilously close to civil war as the apartheid regime started to lose its grip and the new order had yet to be defined. Against this political turmoil, this epidemic took hold, way beyond the gay population, and although the government moved to establish an AIDS response, it was too tied up in the political surge to make any real impression. In addition, which country had been able to deal with HIV and AIDS before us? None, of course. As this confusing new disease started to manifest itself across the world, there were no role models, there was no best practice, there was limited medical understanding, and certainly there was no hope that we would be able to deal with the consequences. For us in the developing world, AIDS fed into the already constructed Western categories of deficiency, of the inability to deal with pressing and social issues, and with a kind of intellectual, economic, and social backwardness. Faced with the blame and condemnation of the West that AIDS came from darkest Africa, from rituals and practices that involved mysterious activities involving the blood of the green monkey, African states fell into multiple levels of denial. First, that AIDS came from Africa at all. Second, that there were any gay people in Africa. Third, that AIDS was a problem. And finally, a denial of any kind of social or sexual behavior that might contribute to its spread and confirm the prejudices of the West. So the early campaigns were muted. They were based to a large degree, however, on what was being said in the US and Europe, and they were underpinned by a sexual and social morality that was and is as unhelpful as it was wrong. These responses concentrated on the individual, they concentrated on sexual transmission, and they concentrated firmly on perceptions of right and wrong. Of course, these messages flew in the face of other information readily available about the level of sexually transmitted infections, teenage pregnancies, and a sexual culture that was perfect for the transmission of HIV, along with the destruction of families, the inadequacies of the health services generally, and about the general well-being of a population which had suffered many years of poverty, humiliation, and oppression. In the late 1980s, we knew and talked about issues that have become current now, such as multiple concurrent partners. We knew about the sexual mores that created an environment for high rates of infection, and we knew that there were complex social and political interventions and interactions, which we now call drivers, that we were driving this epidemic. But I think we still don't know who we are in the new South Africa. Who are we as we sign up for the Soccer World Cup? We have still not managed to get prevention succeeding on any large scale. We do not understand the various social and sexual subcultures that people inhabit and which merge with each other and which determine their lives. We talk about the effects of poverty, but we don't really understand what it means. We have a society in which gender, race, and class issues swirl about disconnected from any real debates, and we have a limited understanding of the social construction of reality of most South Africans. We have become exceptionally good at describing our society and patterns of behavior, but we are much less good at explaining it, understanding it, or indeed finding ways to transform it. But what we know now as social scientists, as we knew then, is that no one is listening to us. So the second lesson. No one is or was listening to us for two reasons. First was the homogenizing agenda of the UN agencies, the World Bank, donors, and their array of experts. And second, there was a medical agenda that set the pattern for the response from the early 1980s. Now, I suppose there was nothing particularly malicious in this. There was no conspiracy. It was merely a reflection of how modern societies always turn to created experts and consultants rather than to intellectuals and theorists in a time of crisis and uncertainty. These social experts and consultants with whom we have to interact almost daily are certainly not trained, I don't think, in anything, but they're not trained in critical social or political theory, and indeed they've always looked for ways to buttress and shore up the status quo rather than to transform it. The medical profession in South Africa, as I think elsewhere, was as confused as everybody else. They were afraid and signaled this fear into the general population. Infection control was extreme, uncertainty was clear in how the disease was spoken about, the lack of treatments which enabled something to be done created a frustration and powerlessness that the medical world was not accustomed to dealing with, and this spilt over into the general population. In medical eyes, it was quite simple to deal with this epidemic. Quite simply, people must change their behavior. Quite simply, people must be given the information, and quite simply, armed with this information and knowledge, they must change. We all now know the consequences of this. It set up and reinforced the stigma attached to the epidemic, because not only had a whole population transgressed in some way to become infected, but even with the mounting but essentially unseen evidence, they could not and did not change their behavior. In the frustration that this generated came the biomedical calls for testing, for an end to confidentiality and partner notification, and a whole range of other extremely rational medical interventions that floated uneasily with a population that felt judged, slighted, and uneasy and nervous. And rather than attending clinics and services, people tended to stay away, dealing rather with this disease in communities where myth and rumor circulate and where unease and social panic spread into blame and shame and sometimes violence. I think we failed to get the medical voices, the experts and the consultants, the UN agencies, to quieten down and listen to us, because we did not have enough solid social theoretical research that could make our case. They were dealing with the immediate, with the urgency of the present, and of course with evidence. Social scientists were asking the long-term difficult questions, and the two positions find very little common ground. The toughness of medicine, with its change your behavior, take your pills approach, and the seeming vagueness of social science found no easy path to deal with what we were confronting. And it is this legacy that we are still grappling with, as the biomedical world dominates the response to the epidemic, with interventions that are both counterintuitive and potentially dangerous to the societies in which they are carried out. So lesson 3 then is about language. I think that in the response to the epidemic worldwide, language has played a powerful and often unacknowledged role. Language is, of course, all about power. It is about how we define the world. It is about how we construct patterns of belief and understanding. And it is, in the end, the means through which a population or a community will believe what they are told or reject the evidence. In most countries, and perhaps the exceptions here might be Australia, Switzerland, and Brazil, the language of AIDS was the language of evasion and caution. We did not tell it like it is, because we are so often choked by the insanity of political correctness and our own discomfort with talking about brutal reality. We have wrapped up the epidemic in layers of euphemisms and prevarications. We have used a language that evaded almost all issues so that no one would be socially, culturally, morally, politically, or racially offended. We have dumbed down the epidemic so that young people, Africans, the illiterate, and the poor would have at least one take-home message which they could act on. And we have developed a response that increasingly is mired in sound bites and cliches. And we have created all kinds of categories of appropriateness and interventions. Now, of course, this language was developed in a number of ways. First, there was the bland, let's not offend anyone discourse of the UN agencies. Then there was the denial from governments that their populations were at risk or behaved in such ways. And of course, there is still the very deep reservoir of racism that is attached throughout the world to people of color, African AIDS, and the exotic behavior of the other. Our language, I think, reflected the pictures that we saw on the front of the AIDS quilts when these are hung at international meetings. The ordered, tidy world of the status quo and convention. It reflected the world as we would like to see it, rather than the world as it is and was at the time. The language used was seamless and bland. Recipes that called for certain ingredients and responses, language that reinforced power and oppression, and language that shut down rather than opened up debate. What we needed was the language from the back of the quilts, the tangled threads, the anger, the mess, the cobbling together of threads, colors, and knots, which are never seen by the right side of the quilt. What is the real undercurrent of our societies that we hide away from and which we wish to hide away? Why do we try so hard to reinforce and recreate the conventional and the status quo? And why is it so extremely threatening to us to embrace difference, deviance, and dysfunction? Why do we seek to defend what is indefensible? And why do we try to make people's lives fit into the dominant worldview rather than seeking to transform how they and we understand each other? Why do we continue to ask status quo questions, do status quo research, and seek status quo answers, rather than doing oppositional research, asking oppositional questions, and perhaps even finding oppositional solutions? What is it about the worlds we inhabit and the words that we use that makes it so complicated for us to talk honestly about sex, death, desire, pleasure, longing, transgression, lust, and betrayal? Why do we long so much for conformity and order, while at the same time knowing that this epidemic is driven precisely through disorder and through different ways of being? Why do we want the orthodoxies, the conventional, the tired, tried, and tested ways? And why do we want to defend the status quo? In most ways, it seems to me pretty indefensible. Why don't we challenge the dominance of these ideas and the society that they have to try and create and foster? And why do we capitulate to power and explanations that we know are both flawed and reactionary?